Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's economics revision lecture for JAM and WAEC. So as I mentioned in the previous videos, revision classes are held on Mondays. We missed last week's revision class, so I've altered the schedule slightly, and we'll be doing theory of production this week, which was meant for last week. So under theory of production, the concepts that we're going to cover are production, division of labor and specialization, scale of production, including internal and external economies, then total, average, and marginal productivity, and finally, the law of variable proportions. So what is production? It is defined as the various economic activities that are aimed at creating goods and services and distributing these goods to the final consumer for the satisfaction of human wants. So by essentially what it means is that production is the making available of goods and services to those who are willing and able to pay for them for the satisfaction of their wants. So there are two types of production. We have direct production and indirect production. With direct production, here you'll be creating goods and services to satisfy purely your household. So it's small scale production just meant to meet family needs. Whereas indirect production, it is a production by specialization for exchange. So here the producer is not trying to satisfy his own or the family's wants. He's trying to basically provide for a large amount of people. Then we also have different classes of production. So the classes we're going to look at are primary, secondary, and tertiary. Under primary production, here, this is the first stage of production that is concerned with the extraction of raw materials from land, air, and sea. So here we can look at things like farming, mining, quarrying, oil drilling, crude oil extraction. So these kind of things all fall under primary production. Last week we had looked at, or a couple of weeks ago, we looked at agriculture. A lot of the agricultural activities that happen on farms fall under primary production. Secondary production, on the other hand, is where you process and transform these raw materials into finished goods. So at this stage of production, you're adding utility to the basic raw materials that you got from primary production. So here we look at businesses like those in manufacturing and construction industries, and because they fall under secondary production. Finally, the last classification of production that we have is the tertiary production. This is the last stage of production, and it's concerned with commercial activities that render both direct and indirect services. So here it's mostly about the distribution of goods or providing services to final consumers. For example, wholesalers, unless if we look at the, from primary to secondary to tertiary, wholesalers would fall at the last end. And that's because if we look at how the goods, or how the resources are transformed along the way, we could see, for example, in the primary stage, we would have extraction of, let's say, tomatoes or farming of tomatoes. In the secondary stage, these tomatoes could be, manufactured and turned into tomato paste. And then in the tertiary stage, we'd have wholesalers who would essentially transport or who would sell loads of these to smaller retailers, loads of the tomato paste, sorry. Other examples of businesses that fall under tertiary production are barbers, hairdressers, teachers, musicians, and other types of, services that you can think of. So the next concept we're going to look at is division of labor and specialization. Division of labor is the act of breaking down the production process into segments or stages so that each segment or stage can be handled by an individual or a group of individuals. So let's look at, I'm going to think of an example of, making a sandwich. That could be an easy thing to think about. Now, with making a sandwich, let's say it's a sandwich that has bread, butter, and then maybe we could add a slice of cheese and some vegetables inside. Now, division of labor would mean that each person has a different task in making that sandwich. So we can start a chain where somebody gets the bread and cuts the bread into the shape that we want. Another person may butter the slices of bread. A third person may add the slice of cheese, and a fourth person the vegetables, and finally the fifth person wraps the sandwich. So division of labors mean that you've broken down the entire process into different stages so that different people would handle the individual elements of the entire process. Now, by doing this, you essentially allow for specialization. And that is the act of engaging on concentrating in one line of production that would lead to your expertise. So now think of the person that butters a slice of bread. If that is what they do day in, day out, because of division of labor, then they would learn to specialize in that craft. And this can be taken to, I guess, more complicated processes. So rather than buttering of bread, it could be the extraction of oil, it could be different things in different industries that would lead somebody to be an expert in that operation that they are performing. So what are the advantages of division of labor? For one, it increases output and productivity. And that's because, as I said, with division of labor, you specialize. And so the more you learn to do something, the better you become at it. And if everybody in the line can become better at what they do, then it would increase output and productivity. It also saves time. It lowers the unit cost. It helps with the use of tools properly. People tend to develop greater skills, and it encourages or promotes mechanization. And finally, there's less fatigue in terms of some of the workers when you don't have to worry about the entire train and you just look at a small aspect. But as with everything, with advantages come disadvantages. So it could also lead to monotony. It could cause unemployment, especially in the case of mechanization when things tend to replace skills of human labor. It could lead to loss of craftsmanship because if, for example, we're building a house and most people at the beginning knew how to build the entire house, but as time goes on, people are only specializing in certain aspects of it. Then at the end of the day, you could end up in a situation where so many people don't actually know how to build a house from start to finish anymore, and they only can focus on their individual aspects. It could create overdependence and instability. And finally, there's a chance of greater risk or hazard at work. So as I mentioned earlier, division of labor can be good. And a lot of, I'm sure, businesses would strive for division of labor in their operations. But then what can limit these businesses from actually, I guess, obtaining division of labor? One of them is the size of the market. Another one is the level of technology. Sometimes you would need adequate technology to be able to divide your processes or simplify your processes. And if you don't have this, then it could be a barrier to you actually, having division of labor in your business. Depending on the type of good that you have, it may not be possible to actually, implement division of labor. For example, if you have seasonal goods, it'll be difficult to divide your labor into different operations or components. Then there's the availability of factory inputs. If these inputs are not readily available or they're scarce to find, then you may not necessarily be able to divide your labor. And finally, special talents or creativity may mean that you may not be able to, I guess, if some people are more creative than others, then you may need them to essentially finish the entire process. I may not be able to teach people or break down the processes into smaller bits. So we've looked at productivity, we've looked at advantages and disadvantages of division of labor. And now we're going to look at scale of production. That is internal, that includes internal and external economies of scale. So what are economies of scale? These are the advantages that a firm or an industry realizes from, producing at a large scale or production expansion. So they include internal economies of scale and external economies of scale. If we focus on internal economies of scale first, these are the cost-saving advantages that a firm enjoys internally as its size of production increases. So think about this. The more a company produces, the bigger it gets in terms of its production, it would enjoy some advantages. These advantages could be financial advantages because they are now able to either borrow more money because they're a big business, or they're making more money and they're able to reinvest the money into their operations. It could be technical advantages. It could be research advantages, commercial or market advantages, risk-bearing advantage, which is a huge one for many companies because the bigger you are, the more you're able to take on more risk. Could be welfare advantage or administrative and managerial advantages. So these are all internal economies of scale. On the other hand, I mentioned that there are also external economies of scale. These are the advantages that a firm or industry realizes from production expansion, but they are benefits that the industry enjoys as it expands, not necessarily the company itself. So because an industry, if I'm a company that operates in, say, the agriculture industry in Nigeria, and my company isn't necessarily producing, I guess, faster, or hasn't experienced an increase in its production, but the agriculture industry in Nigeria is expanding, then there are some external economies of scale that I or my company would experience. These can include specialization, growth of subsidiary or complementary firms, improved technology, infrastructural improvement, or even just the availability of labor. And that is something that would obviously be impactful to my business. But there are also disadvantages of large-scale production. So if a company gets too big or produces too much, there are some disadvantages that it could face, just like there were advantages that we've looked at. These disadvantages include inefficient management. So if you have too many people, I guess, or the company is too big and it's operating at a large scale and management does not know how to handle it, it could be an issue. There could be a lot of bureaucracy and red tapeism. There could be, lack of a personal touch with workers and customers because, again, the company is too big. There could be greater risk and liability. So as I mentioned, one of the advantages is that you're able to take on more risk. But if you take on more risk, you could also be taking on too much of a risk, which would lead to some losses and liability for these losses. There could be waste of resources if, I guess, research isn't done properly. And it could lead to high overhead costs and diminishing returns. Next, we're looking at the concepts of total, average, and marginal productivity. So total, the last lesson we looked at was, we looked at utility, and we looked at, total, average, and marginal utility. And these also, these concepts are quite similar in terms of productivity. So total productivity or total product is the total amount of the commodity that can be produced using a fixed amount of factor inputs at a given period average. Whereas average productivity is the output per unit of input. Now, in terms of outputs and input, I think it's important to note that inputs are, I don't know if you've covered it in your other lessons, but inputs are things that you use into the production of goods and services. And outputs are the goods and services that you get from the production process. So if we're looking at the average productivity again, or average product, it would be the output that you get, the total output you get, divided by the units of inputs that you use to make this. And then finally, marginal product is the extra unit of output produced, resulting from using an additional unit of your factor input. Following on from this is the law of variable proportions. So the law of variable proportions states that as we increase the quantity of one input, which is combined with other fixed inputs, the marginal productivity of the variable input must eventually decline. So it's very similar to the law of, or it's also known as the law of diminishing returns, where essentially the more you increase the input, at some point, you would get less than what it is that you're putting in. But there are some assumptions for the law of diminishing returns or the law of variable proportions to hold. For one, we assume that the state of technology to be constant. So a variable state of technology would impact the marginal and average product. And in that case, we won't be able to accurately study the relationship between output and fixed input. Another assumption that we make is that only one input should be variable, keeping the other inputs constant. So this law of diminishing returns does not actually apply to cases when all the inputs vary proportionately. If that's the case, then we would be, I guess, we would be experiencing returns to scale. The law does not apply to a production scenario where we require specifically fixed proportions of inputs. In such a case, any increase in any input wouldn't actually have an impact on production, since the marginal products will be equal to 0. And finally, the last assumption that we make is that we consider only physical inputs and outputs and not economic profitability in monetary terms. And that is the end. If you have any questions, please do reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Subomi, for that brilliant lecture. Tai, would you have any question for her? Oh, you really have serious issues with your network. Anyways, in the absence of any question, I think we should end it. Are you saying something, Tao? If you can hear me, just if you have any questions, send it to the group. We send it to her if the question relates to her, to our lecture. So I will send it to her. Do you get that? Okay.
All right, no problem.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye.